Thank you. So thank you very much for this kind introduction, also for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to be here. And it is a very important effort, I think. So we have a long tradition as clinical cardiologists in using devices for the patients, in conducting our own studies, and it's also a long partnership with industry. Only recently have become more involved with the regulatory aspects of device policy. And obviously there are some generic problems in that regard, since so far there was no systematic involvement of healthcare professionals in the device approval and assessment process. And although there is a lot of expertise here, I think it makes sense to use this experience. As you're aware, there's currently an inhomogeneous regulatory situation in the European Union. There is a lack of early communication and involvement with regulatory bodies. There is a good thing, namely that there's a large number of novel devices coming onto the market. And just looking at the area of percutaneous heart valve therapies, where some of the devices have already been accepted and provide excellent results, there are many more being developed. And this will also be a challenge in order to assess their value as compared to those already on the market. But there will be challenging new approaches also for our patients. And indeed, new manufacturers developing prototypes that are similar to existing ones, but are they truly the same? This will be difficult to solve. So the European Society of Cardiology realized that there is indeed a need of becoming involved and provided this first paper in 2011, and some of you may already have seen it, about the clinical evaluation of cardiovascular devices, principles, problems, and proposals for European regulatory reform. And a lot of debate has been going on at the European Union level, especially with the joint action plan that is recently being promoted. And this is what we are still seeing now, where the notified bodies are important in terms of approving a device, giving the CE mark. We have competent authorities at the national level, and together this will lead to a CE mark, which corresponds to market authorization, and then to some extent post-marketing surveillance is being performed. Now, if we look at the field of cardiology, what are the lessons that we can learn from the experience that we have already seen? So obviously different areas in cardiology focus with devices. One of the areas is heart valves. Well, we have to admit that animal models are sometimes very different from human models and insufficiently predictive. Bench testing may not always be adequate for the testing of mechanical properties. Fluid mechanical properties are difficult to assess. And then approval of changes as iterative or minor modifications sometimes may lead to substantial implications. So this is something we have to keep in mind, and this is also highlights the fact that we need extensive post-marketing assessment in our patients. When it comes to cardiovascular implantable electronic devices, again, we need long-term registries with independent assessment of the outcome. There's incomplete capture of clinical events by registry with voluntary reporting, especially if events are not that frequent. You need large patient series to detect them. And we need a rapid and open access to reports of device failures. Obviously, we're aiming for transparency, open access, but this is, again, a difficult issue because copyrights and also the assessment needs of such registries needs to be performed in a balanced fashion. So in terms of general considerations, I think it is clearly a balance between safety and innovation. And as you have heard, our patients benefit from an innovation. We as clinical cardiologists or physicians are keen of using these new products, but safety is the other side. And there is a role for regulation in that, where we know that too much regulation restrains innovation and not all regulation leads to improved safety. Overall benefits should obviously outweigh the risks. And ultimately, the goal of all involved players is, and I think should be, but obviously is, to achieve both. And what we also see is that an imbalance in one direction may lead to overcorrection, highlighting the need for structured rules and a balanced framework. And we just need to take the breast implant scandal, which completely led to an alarm bell. And if we just have another scandal without an appropriate framework, we'll end up with overregulation. So it is better to anticipate and find a balanced system right away. There are some differences in the approval pathways between the European and the American system in terms of clinical trials and pre-market assessment. But just knowing that the American system is far more restrictive in terms of demanding far more assessment, especially pre-market assessment, for high-risk devices, and I will focus on Class 3 high-risk devices. We also know that 60% of high-risk devices in the US did not undergo pre-market approval, and many devices are approved on the basis of a 510K clearance, which means substantial equivalence. And there are several examples where so-called minor modifications have substantial implications. And between 2003 and 2007, not a single pre-market approval was denied by the FDA. But still, it is a more cumbersome process, and novel devices are more rapidly available in Europe. And just look at the example of percutaneous aortic valve implantation, which now is an important treatment option for many patients that are inoperable or at high surgical risk. And in Europe, the introduction to the market was far earlier, and we have newer valve generations available as compared to the US. On the other hand, the FDA demanded a systematic evaluation, which led to the performance of important randomized controlled trials, which actually were performed in the US, and which had a beneficial effect, providing the evidence of further use in Europe. So there is probably a role for both, for more rapid access to innovative devices, but you need to study them in a comprehensive fashion. And this is, again, symbiotic for all players. And obviously, these aspects are not mutually exclusive. And if we just look at the example of the adoption of novel heart valves, percutaneous aortic valve implantation in Germany, you will see that there was an early adoption in 2008, and by 2011, 30% of aortic valve procedures in Germany were performed using the novel percutaneous techniques. And this was in part before the randomized trials were published. And these are the data from the partner study, which is the first large randomized trial comparing the use of percutaneous techniques as compared to conservative management in inoperable patients. And you see a substantial drop in mortality in these patients. And indeed, it is comparable in outcome to surgery in high-risk operable patients. So there are other factors involved, and I think tomorrow you will hear more about adoption and reimbursement. But what you clearly see is that there are some countries in Europe, especially Germany and Switzerland, where the adoption has been more rapid. And this also depends, on the one hand, on healthcare spending per capita, and on the other hand, on the reimbursement system. If there is reimbursement on a per implant basis, the adoption and the use of the devices will be far more important as compared to a constrained system that you can see in other countries. There is a lot of debate about the regulation of the European device legislation. And in this process, the European Society of Cardiology has been evolved to some extent and has formulated some ideas in terms of patient safety and clinical evaluation, transparency, expert advice, notified bodies, and post-market surveillance. When it comes to patient safety and clinical evaluation, obviously patient safety for high-risk devices is a priority, and randomized trials are required in the approved process to assess efficacy. But there is need for additional surveillance after marketing in case of reduced requirements for evaluation, and in particular for devices that are being proposed for previously unmet need. Long-term studies with sufficient follow-up to establish safety and efficacy are required. On the other hand, new Class 3 devices that are alternatives to existing cannot be approved simply on the basis of equivalence, because we have seen that minor changes in the device design can have substantial effects on outcomes. The European Society of Cardiology also favors open access to data and results of clinical investigations submitted by the manufacturer in its dossier prepared for the notified body, including the subsequent evaluation by the notified body. Obviously, this is controversial, and I admit that at this place, but I think it is important to at least claim for some degree of transparency in this regulatory process. But obviously, even in the joint action plan, there has been some scrutiny of the notified bodies as they were working today. And the conclusions of relevant national competent authorities concerning clinical trials should also be made publicly available, because they are sometimes not easily accessible. And the evidence submitted and considered when an informed decision has been made about approval of a new device, including expert advice given to the regulatory authorities, should also be accessible. I think this could, in a mean of promoting transparency, benefit all involved parties. But there is indeed a limitation to this policy, in particular when it comes to manufacturing details that are protected by intellectual property, and probably this would need to be worked out on an individual basis. Expert advice is required, and we all know that manufacturers, notified bodies, and competent authorities have access to specialist advisors. However, on the European level, systematic mechanisms for obtaining detailed expert professional advice on devices are not systematically implemented, and this is where professional societies can be helpful to identify specialist advisory groups that can help in such a process. When it comes to the notified bodies, the European Society of Cardiology welcomes the proposals to strengthen the supervision of notified bodies and to increase quality, transparency, and comparability of their processes by enhanced collaboration between competent authorities and the European Commission. And the ESC also advises that it is essential that high-risk medical devices are evaluated only by notified bodies with proven expertise, which is a framework that was not in place until now. And the regulation should give the European Commission the authority to designate a limited number of notified bodies with specific qualifications in areas where expertise is scarce, and these decisions of competent authorities when designating notified bodies should also be reported. When it comes to post-market surveillance, and I think post-market surveillance is particularly important, it is important because some complications may arise at a very low frequency, but we still want to detect them, and we wouldn't be able to detect them with pre-market studies. And also there are some devices that constitute therapeutic approaches to which there was previously no therapy available, where a more rapid introduction into the market is meaningful. And therefore, the concept of conditional approval seems to make sense, and it would enable access to the market for a device fulfilling such a previously unmet need under the provision of collecting further evidence. And for new and innovative Class 3 devices, post-market assessment could work through the establishment of mandatory registries. We cannot ask for controlled randomized trials for every single device, but if we have systematic mandatory registries, that makes sense. And again, the importance of independent analysis And at least this is one desire of professional societies such as the European Society of Cardiology to be involved in the data assessment of such registries. And when it comes to practice, what has happened since the European Society of Cardiology got engaged in this process, we have to say that also on the European Union level, there were very welcoming signals, and the European Society of Cardiology now attends the Clinical Investigation and Evaluation Working Group of the MDAC of the European Commission. The European Society of Cardiology has been represented at the MDAC Vigilance Committee meetings, and at these meetings, member states are presented, industry is represented, and the European Society of Cardiology was the first to be presented from a professional perspective, and it seemed also to generate interest from the political side involved to get a feedback on specific questions. And I think that these bodies would be open to other professional societies who have interest to also be represented at their meetings. Currently, an advisory document on coronary stents is updated. This is an annex to the medical device paper. It used to be the only medical device-specific document in place. It was first published in 2008, but is obviously outdated. So it is now being updated, and the European Society of Cardiology has set up a task force on the topic with the aim of evaluating the need for common standards for the governance and clinical evaluation of coronary artery stents, to provide a systematic review of the literature of all published randomized clinical trials evaluating coronary artery stents between 2002 and 2013, and also to identify areas of unmet needs which would benefit from innovative technologies. There's also a guidance document that is being formulated by the European Union on cardiac ablation, where the European Society of Cardiology has provided some input. And as I hear, other device-specific guidance documents may be considered by the European Commission, provided that these are successful, and it will obviously be an issue as to how to prioritize different topics and as to how to get involved from a professional medical side. So to summarize, I think that progress has been made to improve the regulatory system in the interest of safety for patients in Europe, although there is still some way to go. I think we can all agree that modern medical devices benefit patients enormously, particularly within the field of cardiovascular medicine and surgery. On the other hand, the medical profession is the major user of permanently implanted medical devices for their patients, and physicians act as an important link between regulators, device manufacturers, and patients. And although particularly in times where there is extensive innovations, we're all looking forward to seeing the benefits, there are also risks that some of these devices may not fulfill their expectations, and we have to identify these early enough. And I think that physicians should play an important role in the clinical evaluation of medical devices, and they should offer independent scientific expertise in the approval process, but also in the post-marketing assessment phase. And I think we're all focusing on the devices, but in a patient-oriented way, we want to achieve the most benefit for the patient. And clearly, this is a call for partnership that is required between medical experts and industry within a legislative framework to evaluate and develop new devices and to ensure the safety, while also ensuring innovative evolution of these devices. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for this concise overview on the position of the ESC. Are there comments or questions? Please.
John Brennan from MedTech Europe. I was delighted and it was a great talk, I'm delighted at the end that you said it was about safety. and the benefit risk, as we heard earlier, and then so we have innovation. And earlier in your presentation, you had a note that said it's a balance of safety and innovation. And one thing we're always careful is it's not a balance of safety and innovation, because you don't have innovation if it's not safe. So I really believe that, as was said earlier, it's about benefit and risk, because there is no absolute safety. It's about maybe explaining the benefits and the risks to patients fully so that they understand, and that we get that right. And if we get that right, I think the innovation will follow. So I think we're always careful. Anytime we hear it, we hear even the Commission even saying sometimes, we need to balance safety and innovation. And to me, this is crazy. Why on earth would you let something on the market because it's innovative, but it's okay that it's unsafe? It's just a crazy. So I think we all need to talk about getting benefit risk right and allowing innovation. And it's not a balance between safety and innovation.
Well, in that sense, I agree with you that it's about having innovation which provides safety to our patients. And probably it's rather in the short-term perspective where we need to get the risks right. Because if we take too many risks in the short term, it will hamper innovation in the long run, and if you don't evaluate the risks in the short term. So it's indeed the balance between risk and benefit in the short term and the long-term innovation and safety should be a result of that.
Other questions, comments? Well, there are other questions I would follow up to. I'm not sure if innovation is necessarily unsafe. That's one point. The other point is that you talked about the clinical evaluation and randomized trials. And I think that's one of the crucial points, which also deal with safety. So how is the concept of the ESC, what to consider as safety or risk-benefit ratios? Because you will not be able to have long-term studies before you actually go for a new device and test it. So what is the concept?
I think it needs to be decided upon on an individual basis for every device, and I think this is where the input of experts is required to decide about which pathway is the best. I don't think it makes sense to say we need controlled randomized trial for every device. This would hamper innovation. Probably one compromise is to do more extensive post-marketing assessment by the use of registries, because this is where you detect many things. But you need also transparency in this assessment. And there's things that you wouldn't detect with randomized trials that you detect in larger registries, because there are some events that are not that frequent. On the other hand, if you have some really very novel technologies, such as the use of percutaneous heart valves as compared to classical surgery, it makes sense to also have a randomized trial. And indeed, it worked out. It established the therapy. Without these trials, I think the use of percutaneous valves, which are innovative and benefit the patients, wouldn't be where they are now.
So,
it's interesting because this is an ongoing, very active debate with the council group on this whole issue of clinical information. I think that it's the right balance between pre and post, which will be the solution. On preclinical, there is only so much that can be done actually with devices. There is this ongoing critical relation between the device and the user of the device. And that point is very difficult to duplicate once you go into, let's say, an active or a post-market condition. We can test devices with experts. We can put 10, 20 technicians around them so that basically their hands are guided to the point where essentially, not even sure it's their hand anymore. We can bring them the results of that. We know that when you take these results and then you duplicate these results in the post-market phase, you don't get the same thing. Why? Well, simply because despite training physicians, we can't put, as an industry, 20 technicians around. There are people who are better than others, let's face it. Yes, it is true. And so the critical part is actually how much are we willing to put to do post-market surveillance studies to be able to assess then. That's the only time when you will be able to assess how a device actually performs in actual life. Pre-market will only be a pure theoretical condition.
Okay, that was more a statement. There was one more question here.
Hi, my question's about software-contained cardiac devices, implantable defibrillators or pacemakers. How much of a software change does it have to be before you would consider a new device that would have to go through new randomized clinical trials?
So this is also very important topic, and it's particularly related to the area of pacemakers, cardioverted defibrillators. It is also related to imaging devices. There are different algorithms used in different echocardiographic systems, and we have novel parameters such as tissue strain, and sometimes two manufacturers use different algorithms, and there's a problem with intellectual property, and it's also a problem of standardizing them, but how can you use a parameter that is not standardized between one manufacturer and the other? When it comes to the specific question, how much change leads to a novel device, I think it's important to really test the software in the functioning. I myself am not an expert in software in pacemakers, so I couldn't give you the exact answer to that question. And I think it also highlights the fact that we're not only talking about specialties, but subspecialties, and where you need the expertise. And even in the subspecialties, when it comes to these devices, you have material scientists, physicists, physicians that may all have their contributing role, and that would need to be counseled to get adequate questions. So I myself am not an expert in pacemaker software, unfortunately.
So thank you very much, Dr. Rosenheck. There was a very lively discussion also, and for the sake of time, I think we need to move to the next, and I hand over the chair to Andrew.